The alarm on his phone buzzed at 6 in the morning, a sound so small and insistent in the quiet darkness of his room. For a moment, he just lay there, letting the vibration travel through the wooden nightstand and into the frame of his bed. It felt like a warning. Today was the day. He swung his legs over the side, his bare feet touching the cold floor, and silenced the phone. The room was still and gray, filled with the faint shapes of his life. A stack of textbooks on his desk, a poster of a nebula on the wall, a guitar leaning in the corner. All of it felt a million miles away, like it belonged to someone else. Today, he wasn't a student or a son who played guitar. Today, he was a defendant. He walked to the closet and pulled out the suit. It was his father's, from a wedding he'd attended years ago. The fabric was a heavy dark gray, and it smelled faintly of mothballs and his dad's cologne. He put on the trousers first. They were too long, bunching up around his ankles, and the waist was loose enough that he had to tighten his belt to the last hole. Then the jacket. It hung on his thin frame like a tent, the shoulder pads extending a good inch past his own shoulders. He looked in the mirror and saw a child playing dress up in his father's clothes. The sight was so absurd it almost made him laugh, but the knot tightening in his stomach killed the impulse. He felt like an imposter. Downstairs, the house was empty. A single fluorescent light above the stove cast a lonely glow on the small kitchen. On the refrigerator, held by a magnet shaped like a cartoon cat, was a note in his mother's neat, looping handwriting. "Honey, we're so sorry. Double shift today. We will be thinking of you. Be strong. We love you, Mom." Below it, his dad had scrawled, "You got this, champ. Proud of you." He traced the words with his finger. He was alone. He knew they had to work. The bills didn't stop just because their son was in trouble. But knowing it didn't make the empty house feel any less vast or the silence any less loud. He poured himself a glass of orange juice and drank it, standing at the counter, the cold glass a small, solid reality in his hand. On the table next to the sink was his lifeline, a thick, 3-ring binder filled with photocopies of laws. Highlighted passages from legal textbooks he'd spent weeks studying at the public library, and his own neatly typed notes. He had organized it himself, section by section with color-coded tabs. It was the product of countless late nights, of sacrificing time with friends and weekends, of pushing through the fear that he was in way over his head. He picked it up. It was heavy, a tangible weight of all his preparation. He clutched it to his chest, feeling the rigid plastic cover press against his ribs. This was his lawyer. This was his friend. This was his only weapon. The bus ride downtown was long and jarring. He sat near the back, holding the binder on his lap, watching the city wake up through the grimy window. He saw people walking their dogs, baristas, setting up cafes, delivery trucks double parked. It was a normal Tuesday for everyone else. The world was spinning on, completely unaware of the tiny, personal battle he was about to fight. He opened the binder and flipped to the first tab, a copy of the city ordinance he was accused of violating. He read the words again, for what must have been the 100th time. No person shall be present in any public park or recreation area between the hours of 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. Simple, clear, and he believed fundamentally wrong in how it was being applied. His mind drifted back to the reason he was here. It wasn't just about being in the park after hours. It was about the trees. A grove of ancient oak trees that stood in the center of that very park. Trees that had been there long before the city was built around them. He remembered his grandfather taking him there when he was little. His grandfather, a man whose hands were always stained with dirt from his garden, would point to the massive, gnarled trunks. "Feel that," he'd say, pressing the boy's small hand against the rough bark. "That's history. That's 100 years of sun and rain and storms right there. You can't buy that. You can't build that. You just have to have the sense to leave it be." His grandfather had died 2 years ago, and now the city wanted to cut the trees down to make room for a parking garage. A parking garage. The thought still made a hot anger rise in his chest. It felt like a personal insult, like they were trying to erase a piece of his history, a piece of his grandfather. The protest had been peaceful, A dozen kids, sitting in a circle under the canopy of those old trees, holding candles, singing quiet songs. They weren't causing trouble. They were just remembering. And for that, he'd been arrested, given a court date, and left to fend for himself. The bus hissed to a stop at the downtown transit center. He got off, joining the flow of people heading to their jobs. The courthouse was a few blocks away. It's a monolithic building of gray stone and tall pillars that looked like it had been there forever. It was designed to be intimidating, to make you feel small and insignificant before you even stepped inside. He walked up the wide stone steps, his too long trousers flapping around his shoes, and pushed through a heavy wooden door. The inside was just as imposing. A high ceiling echoed with the sounds of shuffling feet and hushed conversations. Polished marble floors reflected the light from ornate fixtures. People in sharp suits walked with purpose, their leather briefcases swinging from their hands. He saw a woman crying softly into a tissue, a man in handcuffs being led by a guard, a tired-looking couple arguing in low voices. This was a place of problems, of broken lives, of a system that churned on relentlessly. And he was just another cog in its machine. He felt a wave of dizziness, a sudden, powerful urge to turn around and run, to get back on the bus and go home to his quiet room. But then he thought of his grandfather's words, of the feel of the rough bark of his dad's note, "You've got this, champ." He tightened his grip on his binder and kept walking. He found the right courtroom down a long, echoing hallway. The door was slightly ajar. He took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and old paper, and pushed it open. The room was smaller than he'd imagined, with wooden pews for an audience and a high desk for the judge. It smelled like old books and floor wax. A few people were scattered in the gallery, looking bored or anxious. At the front, a man in a suit was organizing papers at the prosecutor's table. He looked confident, relaxed. And then there was the defendant's table. It was empty. A single, lonely chair. That was for him. He walked down the center aisle, his footsteps sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He could feel eyes on him, the curious glances of strangers. He sat down, the hard wooden chair cold against his back. He placed his binder on the table in front of him, arranging it just so. He was alone. There was no one next to him to whisper reassurance, no one to pass him a note, no one to stand up and object when things went wrong. It was just him, his binder, and the entire weight of the justice system. He looked up at the judge's empty chair, a high-backed throne that loomed over the entire room. He thought about his parents, working their long shifts, probably thinking about him right now. He thought about his grandfather. He straightened his back, pulling at the shoulders of his too big jacket. He was ready, or at least he hoped he was. The heavy wooden door at the side of the room creaked open, and a clerk in a black robe announced, "All rise. The court is now in session." The power was about to enter the room. The heavy wooden door at the side of the room creaked open, and a clerk in a black robe stepped out. The sound was like a starting pistol. Everyone in the room stood up in a single, clumsy motion, a rustle of coats and shuffling feet. He stood with them, his hands gripping the back of the wooden chair in front of him, his knuckles white. A man swept in from the side room, his black robes flowing behind him. He was older, with a face that looked carved from worn granite and a mane of silver hair. He moved with an air of absolute ownership, as if the building, the people, and the very concept of justice were his personal property. He didn't look at anyone, not the prosecutor, not the few people in the gallery, certainly not the boy standing alone at the defendant's table. He simply ascended the few steps to his high desk and sat down, settling into his large leather chair with a soft sigh of comfort. The clerk followed him in and took a smaller seat to the side. "You may be seated," the judge said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate up from the floorboards. Everyone sat. The boy sat down too, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He placed his binder carefully on the table in front of him, his hands still trembling slightly. He opened it to the first tab, his eyes scanning the highlighted text he already knew by heart. It was a security blanket, a piece of solid ground in a room that felt like it was tilting. The judge picked up a pen and twirled it in his fingers, his gaze finally sweeping across the courtroom. It was a bored, impatient look, the kind a man gives a long line at the grocery store. His eyes paused for a fraction of a second on the boy, then moved on, dismissing him as utterly unimportant. "We have a docket to get through today," the judge said, his tone flat. "Let's not waste any time. Prosecution, what do we have?" The man at the prosecutor's table stood up. He was young, maybe 30, with a perfectly fitted suit and a confident, easy smile. He looked like he'd just stepped out of a television show. He walked to the center of the room, his steps light and sure. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth and polished, "the people versus—" He glanced down at a paper on his table. "The people versus the juvenile in question. The charge is a violation of City Ordinance 724B, trespassing in a public park after hours." The prosecutor laid out the case with a practiced simplicity. It was a clean, neat story. On the night of October 14th at approximately 11:45 p.m., police officers on patrol observed the defendant and several other individuals in Riverside Park. "The park," he reminded the judge, "closes to the public at 11 p.m. The officers approached the group and advised them they were trespassing and needed to leave. The others complied, but the defendant refused. He was asked again, and he again refused. He was then placed under arrest without incident." The prosecutor made it sound so simple, so cut and dry. A rule was broken. A punishment was deserved. He never once mentioned why they were there, never spoke of trees or protests or anything that might add a splash of color to his black and white story. He made the boy sound like a common punk, looking for trouble as the prosecutor spoke. The boy felt a familiar heat rise in his chest. It wasn't the whole story. It was a carefully edited version, a lie of omission. He wanted to shout out, "But what about the trees? What about the city charter?" But he didn't. He just sat there, his hands clenched into fists under the table, and waited his turn. When the prosecutor finished, he gave a slight bow to the judge and returned to his seat, looking very pleased with himself. The judge nodded, his expression unchanged. "Very efficient," he said. Then he turned his gaze, finally, directly onto the boy. The weight of that look was immense. It wasn't just a glance. It was an assessment, a judgment that had already been made. And how does the defendant plead? The boy stood up. His legs felt shaky, like they might not hold him. He cleared his throat, which felt dry and tight. "Your Honor," he started, his voice smaller than he wanted it to be. He cleared his throat again, trying to find some strength. "I would like to address the nature of the ordinance and its conflict with the city's own charter, which guarantees the right of the people to peacefully assemble and petition their government for a redress of grievances." He had practiced this line. He thought it sounded professional, intelligent. He thought it would show the judge that this wasn't just a simple case of a kid breaking a rule. The judge leaned forward in his chair, flicker of something in his eyes. It wasn't interest. It was amusement. A slow smile spread across his face, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He looked over at the prosecutor, who was trying to suppress a grin. Then he looked back at the boy. "Son," the judge said, his voice dripping with a kind of theatrical condescension, "save the theatrics for your high school drama club. You broke the law. It's that simple." A few snickers rippled through the gallery. The boy felt his face flush hot with shame. He had expected a serious legal discussion, not a punchline. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but the judge held up a hand, silencing him before he could even begin. "This is not a constitutional law seminar at some fancy university." The judge continued, his voice getting louder, more performative. He was playing to the room now. "You are a child who was where he wasn't supposed to be. You were told to leave. You didn't. End of story." The boy's mind was racing. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. In the books he'd read, the defendant was allowed to present their case. They were allowed to speak. He took a breath, trying to push past the humiliation that was washing over him in waves. He had to try again. "Your Honor, if I may," he said, his voice a little stronger this time. "The specific wording of the city charter, Article 4, Section 2, states that public spaces are held in trust for the people, and that any ordinance that restricts access must be for a compelling public interest and must not infringe upon the rights of assembly. He was proud of that sentence. He'd worked on it for days. He thought it was unassailable. The judge leaned back in his chair and let out a short, sharp laugh. It was an ugly sound, like a bark. "The city charter? Did you read that on a cereal box this morning?" he asked. The gallery erupted in more laughter this time, louder and more confident. The boy could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him, and he knew they were all seeing the same thing the judge wanted them to see. A silly little boy playing dress-up in his daddy's suit. "Pretending to be a lawyer? You're a child playing lawyer," the judge said, his smirk widening. "This isn't a debate club. You're wasting the court's time, and everyone else's." He gestured vaguely around the room, inviting the audience to share in his exasperation. The boy saw an older woman in the front row shake her head and look down at her lap, a look of pity on her face. He saw a man in the back row smirking at his friend. He felt utterly alone, a tiny island in a sea of ridicule. His anger was now a burning coal in his stomach. The shame was still there, hot and suffocating, but underneath it a harder, colder feeling was taking hold. This man wasn't just dismissing his argument. He was dismissing him. He was dismissing his grandfather's trees, his parents' hard work, the hours he had spent in the library, the very idea that his voice mattered. He didn't sit down. He stood his ground, his back straightening, his chin coming up just a fraction. He looked directly at the judge, a flicker of defiance in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He saw the judge notice it, saw the smirk falter for just a second, replaced by a flash of irritation. The judge was used to people cowering. He wasn't used to this. Seeing that he wasn't backing down, the judge's performance escalated. He leaned forward again, his hands flat on the desk, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, mocking tone. "All right, counselor," he said, drawing the word out, dripping it with sarcasm. "You seem to have all the answers. You've got it all figured out. Why don't you educate us? Go on, the floor is yours. Tell the court how your late-night picnic in the park is some great stand for freedom." The judge leaned back and crossed his arms, a look of cruel expectation on his face. It was a trap, and they both knew it. He was giving the boy just enough rope to hang himself with, setting him up for one final public humiliation. The boy could feel the silence in the room, thick and heavy. It was the silence of an audience waiting for a show, waiting for him to fail. He thought about his dad's note, "You got this, champ." He thought about his grandfather's hand on the rough bark of the old oak tree. He took a long, slow breath, the air feeling cool and sharp in his lungs. The judge had given him the floor. He was going to take it. The silence in the room was a physical thing. It pressed down on his shoulders, thick and heavy, filled with the unspoken laughter of the people in the gallery. He could feel the judge's eyes on him, a predatory gaze waiting for him to stumble, to fail, to give them all the show they were waiting for. The judge's taunt, "All right, counselor," still hung in the air like stale cigar smoke. Every part of him screamed to just sit down, to take the punishment, to make it all stop. The shame was a fire in his cheeks, and the anger was a cold knot in his stomach. But underneath it all, a different feeling was starting to bubble up, a cool, clear thought that cut through the noise. This man, this judge, wasn't interested in justice. He was interested in his own power and the performance of it, and he had just made a mistake. He had handed over the microphone thinking it was a prop for a comedy. The boy was about to use it as a tool. He didn't speak right away. He let the silence stretch, letting the judge's confidence curdle into impatience. He took one slow, deliberate breath, and then another. He looked down at his binder, not as a nervous student looking for notes, but as a craftsman looking at his tools. He wasn't going to argue about the trees. He wasn't going to plead with their sense of morality. The judge had already shown he had none. He was going to do something else. He was going to change the game entirely. When he finally looked up, his expression was different. The nervousness was gone, replaced by a calm, steady focus. His voice, when it came, was no longer shaky or small. It was clear and even, and it carried to every corner of the quiet room. "Your Honor," he began, his eyes fixed on the judge, "you are correct. This is not a debate club. And you are also correct that this is not a constitutional law seminar. This is a court of law, where the rules of that law are supposed to apply equally to everyone, including the city government. A flicker of confusion crossed the judge's face. This wasn't the desperate, stammering defense he had been expecting. The boy continued, his tone measured and precise. I am not here to talk about my feelings about trees, or to make a grand stand for freedom. I am here to talk about a specific legal precedent that directly relates to this case. He reached into his binder and pulled out a photocopied document, the paper yellowed at the edges, the text slightly blurry. He held it up. This is a ruling from the state Supreme Court from 1978. The case is called The People v. O'Connell.
Ow!
He paused, letting the name of the case land in the room. The judge leaned forward slightly, his smirk finally gone, replaced by a look of sharp annoyance. The prosecutor, who had been leaning back in his chair with an air of victory, suddenly sat up straight, his brow furrowed. The mood in the room was shifting, the electric current of mockery being replaced by the low hum of genuine curiosity. In The People v. O'Connell, the boy continued. His voice unwavering, the court ruled on a very similar situation. A group of citizens were arrested for holding a silent vigil in a public square after it had closed for the night. The city argued, just as the prosecutor has argued today, that it was a simple violation of a curfew ordinance. But the state Supreme Court disagreed. He walked over to the bench and, with a confidence that surprised even himself, placed the photocopy on the edge for the clerk to see. The judge's eyes flickered down to the document, then back to the boy's face. The court's ruling in that case established a critical principle, the boy said, turning back to face the room. They wrote, and I'm quoting here, an ordinance that restricts the time, place, and manner of expressive conduct in a traditional public forum cannot be enforced against a citizen, unless the municipality can demonstrate that it has provided a reasonable alternative for that expression. In simple terms, Your Honor, what that means is that the city can't just close a public space to shut people up. If they're going to use a rule like a park curfew to stop a protest, they have to offer another way for that protest to happen. He was no longer a scared teenager. He was a teacher, and the entire courtroom was his class. He could see the judge's jaw tighten. He could see the prosecutor frantically flipping through a file, clearly having never heard of this case. He saw the board clerk sit up a little straighter. And in the back row, a woman who had been slumped in her seat. A reporter from the local paper he recognized from her picture in the paper was now watching him intently, a pen in her hand. Now, how does a 40-year-old case about a vigil in a square apply to a teenager sitting in a park? He asked, posing the question himself before anyone else could. He reached back into his binder and pulled out a second piece of paper. This one was crisp and white, printed with the official letterhead of the city's Department of Parks and Recreation. This, he said, holding it up, is a copy of a public records request. It's a request that I and a group of other students submitted to the city 6 weeks ago. We requested a permit to hold a daytime rally in that very same park, in the designated area for public gatherings, to protest the removal of the oak trees. We were willing to follow all the rules. We wanted to be there during the day when the park was open. We wanted to do it the right way. He walked back to the bench and placed this document next to the first one. 2 pieces of paper, sitting side by side under the judge's gaze. One was old law, the other was new evidence. Together, they formed a story the judge hadn't been prepared to hear. And this, he said, pulling out one final sheet, is the city's official response to that request. It's a letter denying our permit. He read from the letter, his voice ringing with a cold, hard clarity. The request for a permit is denied due to concerns about foot traffic damage to the lawn and potential disruption to other park patrons. They denied us the legal, reasonable alternative. They closed the only door they had left open, and then they arrested us for trying to get in through the window. He let that sink in. The courtroom was completely silent now, but it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't the silence of mockery. It was the silence of shock. The judge was staring at the documents on his bench, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He had been outmaneuvered not with emotion or passion, but with cold, hard facts. The boy had not played the game the judge had set up. He had changed the rules and won. The boy looked directly at the judge, his gaze steady and unflinching. The power in the room had shifted so completely he could almost feel it in the air, a change in pressure. "Your Honor," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of everything he had just laid out. "This isn't about me breaking the law. This is about the city breaking it first. They violated our constitutional right to assemble by denying us a reasonable alternative. And then they used a minor ordinance to punish us when we tried to exercise that right anyway. The case against me isn't just weak. It's a miscarriage of the very laws this court is supposed to uphold." He finished speaking and stood there, not as a defendant waiting for a verdict, but as a man who had stated his case. He had nothing more to say. The judge stared at him, his face turning a deep shade of red. He looked from the boy to the papers on his bench, then to the prosecutor, who just shrugged helplessly. The judge opened his mouth, then closed it, looking like a fish out of water. He had been so sure of himself, so confident in his ability to crush this kid. And now, the entire dynamic of the courtroom had been flipped on its head. The boy was no longer standing alone. He was standing with the weight of state law and documented evidence right beside him. The silence that followed the boy's final words was not the silence of a courtroom, but the silence of a frozen moment. It was the quiet that settles after a sudden, unexpected crash, when everyone is still trying to understand what just happened. The judge stared, his mouth slightly agape, the color in his face rising from a deep red to a dangerous, mottled purple. He looked like a man who had stepped onto a firm patch of ground only to find it was quicksand. The two pieces of paper on his bench seemed to mock him. One, a dusty relic of forgotten law, the other, a crisp, white testament to his own city's arrogance. He had built a career on intimidation, on the assumption that no one who came before him, especially not a teenager in an ill-fitting suit, would ever be prepared enough to challenge him. He had been wrong. For a long moment, the judge did nothing. He just stared at the boy, his eyes burning with a fury that was now laced with panic. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He tried to speak again, managing a strangled sputter. That's preposterous," he finally managed to say, his voice a weak imitation of its earlier booming authority. "This is a municipal court, not some academic symposium. You can't just come in here and throw around old cases like they mean something." But the conviction was gone. The words were hollow, and everyone in the room knew it. The prosecutor, looking pale and sweaty, was rifling through a thin file, his eyes wide with panic. He had nothing. He had walked in expecting a 5-minute sentencing and was now facing a full-blown constitutional crisis he was completely unprepared for. The judge looked at him, a desperate plea for backup. But the prosecutor just shook his head almost imperceptibly. A silent admission of defeat, the power that had once radiated from the judges. Bench like heat from a furnace had now dissipated, sucked into the vacuum created by the boy's quiet, methodical argument. The judge was no longer a towering figure of authority. He was a cornered man, and his only remaining instinct was to escape. He grabbed his gavel, his hand shaking so badly that it rattled against the wooden block. The sound it made was not a decisive bang, but a pathetic clattering thud. "This court is in recess," he barked, the words sharp and brittle. He didn't wait for anyone to stand. He shoved his chair back with a screech of wood against wood and swept out of the room, his black robes billowing behind him like a storm cloud in retreat. The side door slammed shut with a final, echoing boom that left the room in a state of stunned silence. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Then the spell was broken. The prosecutor slumped into his chair, running a hand through his hair. The clerk began shuffling papers, pointedly avoiding eye contact with anyone. And in the gallery, a low murmur began to spread. A wave of whispers and astonished glances, all aimed at the boy who was still standing, alone, at the defendant's table. He took a deep breath, the air feeling lighter now, cleaner. He could feel his own heart still beating fast, but it was no longer the frantic drumbeat of fear. It was the steady, powerful rhythm of victory. He was about to sit down when a woman approached him from the gallery. She was in her late 30s, with a notepad and pen in her hand. He recognized her from the city newspaper. Her picture was next to her column every week. "That was incredible," she said, her voice filled with genuine admiration. "I've been covering this court for 3 years and I have never seen anything like that. My name is Anya, with the Chronicle. Do you have a moment?" He just nodded, still a bit dazed. She asked him questions, not like a prosecutor, but like someone who was genuinely curious. She asked about the trees, about his grandfather, about the hours he spent in the library. He found himself talking, the words flowing out of him more easily than he expected. As they spoke, a young man in a slightly rumpled suit approached. He looked like he was in his early 20s, and he had the tired but focused look of a law student. "Excuse me," he said, waiting for a pause in the conversation. "I'm just observing today for a class." "What you did?" "Citing O'Connell like that. That was brilliant. Honestly, most practicing attorneys wouldn't have thought of that." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. "I volunteer with the Civil Liberties Union. If you need any help, any representation at all, please give us a call. Pro bono, it's the least we can do." The boy took the card, the crisp, stiff paper, feeling like a trophy in his hand. He looked from the reporter to the law student, to strangers who were now his allies. He wasn't alone anymore. The heavy wooden door at the side of the room creaked open again, and the judge walked back in. He looked flustered, his silver hair slightly disheveled. He avoided looking at the boy, his gaze fixed on his desk as he sat down. The energy in the room had completely changed. He was no longer in charge of the performance. He was just an actor who had forgotten his lines. "The court will come to order," he said, his voice flat and devoid of its earlier menace. He shuffled the papers on his desk for a moment, a nervous, fidgety motion. "After a review of the materials presented by the defense," he said, stumbling over the word defense as if it left a bad taste in his mouth, "the court finds that the prosecution's case is insufficient to proceed at this time." Cleared his throat, still not looking up. "Therefore, the charge against the defendant is dismissed." Without prejudice, he banged the gavel again, this time a quick, sharp rap that sounded less like a verdict and more like an escape. "We're adjourned." With that, he was gone again, disappearing into his chambers before anyone could react. The prosecutor gave the boy a quick, almost apologetic nod before packing his briefcase and hurrying out. The boy stood there for a moment, letting the words dismiss sink in. It was over. He had won. He gathered his binder, the heavy weight now feeling light as a feather, and walked out of the courtroom into the bright, noisy hallway. The world outside was the same as it had been that morning, but he felt different. The too-big suit didn't feel like a costume anymore. It felt like armor. He found a quiet bench in a small plaza outside the courthouse and pulled out his phone. His hands were still trembling a little as he dialed his mother's number. She picked up on the second ring, her voice tight with worry. "Honey, are you okay? What happened?" He took a breath, a smile spreading across his face for the first time all day. "It's over, Mom," he said. "They dismissed the case. I won." There was a silence on the other end of the line, and then he heard a sound he would never forget. His mother's quiet, sobbing laugh of pure relief. He could hear his father's voice in the background, asking what was wrong. "He did it," his mother said, her voice thick with emotion. "He did it." Talked to them for a few minutes, trying to explain what had happened. But words seemed inadequate to describe the shift in the room. The look on the judge's face, the feeling of the power turning in his favor. All he could really say was, "I told them the truth, Mom," and they listened. The next day, the story was everywhere. The headline in the City Chronicle, written by the reporter from the courtroom, read, "Teen's legal jujitsu stuns mocking judge." The article was a detailed, glowing account of his argument, painting him as a David against a Goliath. But it was the video that really broke the story open. Someone in the gallery had been recording on their phone. The clip, which started just as the boy began his speech about the people v. O'Connell, was raw and powerful. It showed the judge's face transforming from arrogant amusement to shocked fury, and the boy's calm, steady delivery. It went viral within hours, shared millions of times across the country. The city council, which had been quietly supporting the judge and the prosecutor, was suddenly flooded with angry emails and phone calls. The national news picked up the story, and the image of the lone teenager standing up to a bullying judge became a symbol of a new generation's fight for accountability. The formal complaint from the Civil Liberties Union, filed by the law student who had been in the courtroom, was the final nail in the coffin. The city launched an official investigation into Judge Wallace's conduct, and reporters began digging into his past, uncovering a long history of similar incidents of bias and intimidation. The power shift hadn't just happened in the courtroom. It was echoing through the entire city, toppling the powerful and giving a voice to the one person who had dared to stand alone. The weeks that followed were a strange and dizzying whirlwind. A life so different from the one he had known just a month ago that it felt like he was living in someone else's skin. The video of his courtroom argument didn't just go viral. It became a cultural touchstone. It was played on news channels, analyzed by legal experts on talk shows, and shared endlessly online. He, the quiet boy in the too big suit, became an overnight symbol. Strangers would stop him on the street, not to point or laugh, but to shake his hand, to thank him, to tell him their own stories of feeling powerless against a system that was designed to be intimidating. The first real test of this new reality came at a city council meeting 3 weeks after the trial. The agenda was open for public comment, and the chamber was packed. It was a stark contrast to the lonely courtroom. Every seat was filled, and cameras from local and even national news outlets were lined up along the back wall. Their lenses pointed at the council members like a firing squad. When his name was called to speak, a ripple of applause went through the room. He walked to the podium, his parents right behind him, his mother squeezing his shoulder one last time before he stepped up to the microphone. This time, he wasn't wearing his father's suit. He was in a simple sweater and jeans. He didn't have a thick binder of notes. He just had his thoughts. He looked out at the sea of faces, at the reporters, the council members who looked suddenly small and uncomfortable in their big leather chairs. He took a breath, and he began to speak. He didn't talk about legal precedents or city charters. He talked about respect. He talked about how the law was supposed to be a tool for everyone, not a weapon for the powerful. He spoke about his grandfather and the old oak trees, not as a legal argument, but as a story about memory and why things matter. His voice was clear and steady, the same voice he had found in the courtroom. But now it was filled with a quiet passion that resonated through the silent room. When he finished, there was a moment of absolute silence. And then the room erupted in applause, a sound so loud and genuine it shook the walls of the old chamber. The mayor, a man who had been on the phone with him just the day before, stood up and addressed the crowd. "On behalf of the city," he said, his voice thick with a formality that sounded like an apology. "I want to thank this young man for his courage and for reminding us all what public service is truly about." Effective immediately, all plans to remove the grove of oak trees in Riverside Park are canceled. Furthermore, the city will be working with the Civil Liberties Union to review our ordinances on public assembly to ensure they are fair. "And just for all our citizens," then he added, looking directly at the boy, "and we will be commissioning a plaque to be placed in that grove, to commemorate the citizens who stood up to protect our city's history." The applause was deafening. It was over. He had not only won his case, he had won the war. The fallout from his victory continued to spread. The investigation into the judge concluded with a formal censure, a public reprimand that was a permanent stain on his record. A week later, the judge announced his early retirement, citing health reasons. The boy saw a picture of the judge leaving the courthouse for the last time in the paper. He looked smaller, older, his silver hair limp and his shoulders slumped. The man who had seemed like a giant in his courtroom was just a man, defeated and fading away. There was no triumph in the sight, just a quiet, sad finality. The power had shifted, and it had left him behind. A few days after that, a letter arrived. It was from a prestigious law school in the state capital, one he had only ever dreamed of attending. It wasn't an acceptance letter. It was something else. It was an offer of a full 4-year scholarship, established by an anonymous donor who had been inspired by his demonstration of courage and intellectual rigor. He read the letter 3 times, his hands trembling as they had in the courtroom. But this time it was with disbelief and overwhelming gratitude. The path that had seemed so impossibly out of reach was now laid out before him, clear and bright. But the biggest change was the quiet one, the one that happened inside the walls of his own home. The tension that had once filled the small house. The unspoken worry about money and his future had been replaced by a new kind of energy. One evening, his father came home from his shift at the factory looking more tired than usual. He sat down at the kitchen table where the boy was doing his homework. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at his son for a long time, a look so full of pride and wonder that it made the boy's throat feel tight. Then his father reached into his pocket and pulled out a small worn wallet. He took out a $20 bill and pushed it across the table. "Here," he said, his voice a little rough. "Go take your friends out for a pizza." On me. The boy knew his father couldn't really afford it. He knew that $20 was an hour of hard, physical labor. He also knew it wasn't about the pizza. It was his father's way of saying, "You don't have to fight these battles alone anymore. You've done enough. Let me take care of you now." He pushed the bill gently back toward his father. "Thanks, Dad," he said, smiling. "But maybe we can just order one in. My treat." His father looked at him for a second, and then a slow, wide smile spread across his face. The kind of smile that the boy hadn't seen in years. It was the smile of a man who saw his son not just as a child to be protected, but as a man to be proud of. The story found its final, quiet chapter a few weeks later. He was asked to be a guest speaker at his high school's law club, a small informal group of students who met in a dusty classroom after school. He walked in, not as a celebrity or a viral sensation, but just as a former student. There were only about a dozen kids there, sitting in mismatched chairs, looking at him with a mixture of awe and curiosity. He didn't give a big speech. He just pulled up a chair and sat down with them. He told them the story, not the dramatic version they'd seen online, but the real one. He talked about being scared, about feeling alone, about the humiliation of being mocked. He talked about the long hours in the library, about the doubt, about the moment he decided he had nothing left to lose. A girl in the front row, a freshman with braces and a nervous expression, raised her hand. "Weren't you terrified?" she asked. "I mean, talking to a judge like that? I don't think I could ever do that." He looked at her, and he saw himself. He saw the fear and the uncertainty, but he also saw a flicker of something else, a spark of wanting to believe she could make a difference. He smiled, a genuine, warm smile. "I was absolutely terrified," he said. "My hands were shaking so much I thought I was going to drop my papers. But then I realized something. The fear doesn't really go away. You just have to decide that what you're fighting for is more important than the fear. You find one thing, one fact, one truth that you can hold on to, and you just don't let go." He looked around the room at the young faces, at the future lawyers and activists and leaders, and he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He wasn't the boy who stood alone in a courtroom anymore. He was a part of something bigger now. He was a link in a chain, passing on the lesson his grandfather had taught him. The lesson he had learned for himself under the harsh lights of a city courtroom, that a single voice, armed with the truth and a little bit of courage, can indeed change the world. And as he answered their questions, his voice calm and sure, he knew that this was just the beginning.